Today on the Nurse on Purpose podcast, we're going to be deep diving into a conversation that means so much to me. It is at the heart of my mission, of my purpose, and that is the image of nursing. My guest today is Scanlon McGinity, a nurse, a thought leader, and the author of the article, Revisioning the Image of Nursing. Anne is challenging how we see ourselves and how the world sees us, from rethinking the very word nurse itself to redefining what leadership in our profession really looks like. Anne believes that it is time to stitch together both the soul of the nurse with the scientist's mind, the leader's voice, and the entrepreneur's courage. It gives me great pleasure to welcome a legend in our profession today to the podcast. You're welcome, Anne.
Thank you. Glad to be here, Nello, and to have the conversation with you today.
I'm grateful to have you here. So today we're going to be talking about really your roots, how you got started in nursing. And then I want to dive into your article and what really inspired you to write that article. We're going to talk about outdated perceptions of the nursing profession and what you believe the future of nursing should look like. So let's get started. The first thing I want to tackle is your background. What was it that drew you into this profession? What was that pivotal moment when, as we discussed before, when you chose nursing over medicine?
Yeah, it started very early. I grew up in New York City, and I broke my arm when I was in the third grade and had the experience of being taken care of by a Dominican sister of the sick poor who really, truly was like a vision of an angel of mercy. I then proceeded to work with that group. They were public health nurses in New York City. And when I was in the 8th grade, went out with them to people's homes in the city that were probably diabetic patients or patients who had some chronic illness. From that, it evolved through high school, became engaged with a really interesting Vincentine program at St. Vincent's Hospital in the Bowery. So I had exposure to really poor people who needed care and received care, and the learning environments in those opportunities were incredible. And it really felt like a calling, and I felt that's really what I wanted to do. So fast forward, after high school, I did go in the convent for a few years and then realized I loved nursing and wanted to go and spend my time in nursing. Proceeded into that, and one of the first jobs I ever had was actually in Newark, New Jersey at the time of the riots. I worked in an ED department where really the care of the patient was central, and you were treated respectfully and taught how to do things way beyond what I would say was the scope of nursing. But I learned that there were an interactive process with people and caring about the people in the community that I worked in, and also the knowledge about what it was that could make a difference. So if I fast forwarded on to then getting into an opportunity in a trauma center, and I highlight that as probably one pivotal experience because in that trauma center, it wasn't only about nursing, it was about the patient, and everybody's job was to focus on the patient. And the expectation was that you knew everything about that patient. So whether you were a physician, a resident, whomever, that was the expectation. You knew that patient, and we were, as a team, caring for that patient. Never, ever felt any disregard for my role as a nurse, but the contributor was to the patient team. And I learned that early on. And I learned also there the continuity of care that you had from picking the patient up in the field all the way through back into the home. And I could gain a perspective on the patient's experience and the clinician's experience. I quickly moved. I had a very great mentor, as we all have great mentors. And long story short, her name was Scanlon too. And she would challenge me. She was a leader who understood the people that worked for her. I went into that, and she hired me with a master's degree in child psych that had nothing to do with trauma, but understood education would change systems and allowed me the flexibility to create roles, a role for a psychiatric clinical nurse specialist, and then moved into administration, then to move mentoring people, guiding people to get great care for patients. I have to say it was probably the earliest magnet type of environment that I ever worked in. And from there, it just moved into administrative positions, looking at a big picture strategically at where did nursing need to go and the roles that they played on the team. So that kind of colored my choice of career over time. So I ended up being a chief nurse. Eventually you end up, taking on additional responsibilities and work for great systems, which allowed me to strategically look at what operations needed to be, but also planning for the future of where was the nurse going to be in these systems. So I've had a great career doing that in a variety of academic teaching hospitals. So certainly was exposed early on to magnet concepts and to looking at evidence-based practice, looking at the future of nursing, and really getting nurses on a team that were respected by anybody and everybody that was on that team. So that's a long story about the history of how I got to be where I got to be.
And we talked about your Irish roots, right? We're looking at your backdrop, and we see the
Yes.
Irish cabinet, right, filled with little gifts,
Yeah.
and the mementos from people. How did that shape your kind of professional mission, if it did in
Yeah.
any way?
Yeah. There was always a sense growing up in our family, and great Irish families, they're not quiet people. They're very vocal. Music was a big part of that, but the key was education. Both of my parents, my mom immigrated from Ireland and had probably, I'm going to guess, about a fourth grade education, but smart, bright, talented woman who was very clear. Don't be ever worried about getting married. Get an education because the education will last. So that played a key role in many of the jobs, as I explained early on, as I came back from a broken arm, working in a healthcare system, to early on being interested in the care process, but the educational process as well. My dad was pretty much the same, had maybe a high school education when he finished, but the focus on changing, making a difference with who you are from where you are led really to nursing and seeing the vast ability, even back then, had the insight, and maybe from mentors around me, to see that the nurse made a clear difference in the activities of daily living and life lived in whatever the situation was. And that seemed important to me. So when I did go to graduate school, I had a dad who obviously was as confused. He'd say to me, "Why are you going for a PhD? Why not just be a doctor?" Which forced me at some point to think, well, maybe I should at least consider what he's saying. And I went over at the University of Maryland. There was a dean, and I went over to the dean of the medical school. And it was so obvious to me in the conversation that I was in the right program for nursing. I cared about people. I cared about systems. I cared about the people who cared about them. And I wasn't looking for cures only individually, trying to make one patient better at a time. I saw systems of care that really need to affect people. And it wasn't just when they hit the health system, but it was where they lived, how they lived, and all those factors that affected them. So growing up in a family that stressed education pushed me to consider other ways of looking at things. I think that was the biggest gift of education, is like, if I had to look at it and what I saw was not true, what else might be true in this situation? And it forced those issues. So, but also, growing up in an Irish Catholic family, if you wanted to be heard, you had to talk. And you had to talk loudly, or you weren't heard and they mowed over you. Really, I learned that. I learned that you stood up for what you thought, and you had to clearly think about it, and you had to be able to be on your toes to be able to engage in the conversation. And they were great conversations. Great conversations. Religion played a big part in that. Belief in people, belief in, God, and the work that you were to do, and that you would be a difference maker. Certainly sold into my philosophy.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense, especially to this article that you've written so boldly and
Mhm.
so passionately. It reads like a call to arms in many ways. I read the article and I was completely intrigued by every word.
Mhm.
Article is titled "Revisioning the Image of Nursing." What was the turning point for you that made you say enough is enough? We need to fix this. We need to change this narrative. This image needs to evolve.
Right. My sense in the general nursing profession was we were constantly looking back and not looking ahead, that we were tweaking things. And Florence, who set us on a path that had some very, very basic and important kinds of attributes that you had for nursing. And though she espoused many things about education and training and looking out, there wasn't really a pathway to do that. And what I honestly felt was that nursing grew up in the shadow of medicine, didn't have a voice, and it grew up very much in a military model. And a military model presupposes that you take orders, you're obedient, you do what you're told. And I guess if you had any creativity, you either manipulated that or you didn't do it. You just simply did what you were told. You were loyal, many great attributes were loyal, you were trustworthy, etc. But for nursing to really impact the care of patients, that has held us in bondage for a century or for the time that we've been there. And we keep looking back to her as a role model rather than saying, what is the one we have to look forward? And I think Florence herself would say, get a grip, look to the future. Where do you want to be versus I got you this far, but how do you get to the next? And what I would find is the literature was replete with metaphors that reinforce this image of battles, fatigue, fighting, in the trenches, all images of nurses victimized really by a system. And I didn't see that. I never had that experience. I'll be honest. I never had that experience growing up, whether it was in school or it was in a work environment. I mentioned the trauma center. People would say, didn't you have to get up and give the physician the chair when he came in? I said, no. But I would get up and give him the chair because he was up all night. He looked tired, and the decent human thing would be, sit down, I'll get you a cup of coffee. He would do the same for me. We were equals in the fact that we focused on the patient, not on ourselves. So I think that's always what kind of got me going on. What is the vision we want in the future? Very much we're looked at because we're trustworthy, we're honest, we're compassionate, we're caring. All these mothering images, which are nurturing, very good images, but they're limiting because that's what the public sees. And if you looked at the pandemic, it was a great thing that showed that. You had nurses, for the most part, with, fatigue, and they had masks on, and they looked like death warmed over. And they became heroes for that versus heroes for the things that they actually really did, which was pivot incredibly fast to create systems that could manage vaccinations and all the things. They didn't focus on that and the intellectual side or the creative or the entrepreneurial side. It was more on poor worn out souls that, were sitting on the floor crying. That's a piece of it, but that's not the only piece. So that's always been there. That metaphor has always bothered me, the military model metaphor. And the longer we cling to it and the more we use that in terminology, in writing, and it is so subtle at times that you don't even see it, but it holds you back to a model that's not a future-oriented one that's going to change and transform healthcare.
Yeah.
So that's how I got into looking at what's the vision and where do we want to go and who's leading us with that, which led to really the article or to letter to the editor. I got tired of listening to people, looking back instead of looking forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So these limited portrayals of nurses as heroes can actually do a disservice to our intellectual and artistic dimension that the profession brings along with it. Now, you mentioned the pandemic, so I want to stay on that for just a short minute. You mentioned in the article that it was both a catalyst and a crisis, right? A moment that you said birthed a platform for innovation and redesign and gave us the chance to publicly re-image the contributions of nurses. What parts of that reimagining do you think that we have gotten right so far as nurses ourselves, and where do you think we've fallen short?
Well, I'll start with the shortfall. The biggest shortfall is we still don't have a vision of who and where we want to be. We don't have that. So what you have now is many people trying many different things, attacking different issues or looking at different issues, bullying, reimbursement, all of those things. But till you actually create the vision and there is consensus of this vision of the nurse of the future, then then you're putting the cart before the horse. You're coming up with all ways to tackle singular issues within the profession rather than let's create the vision. Let's get consensus that this is who we are, where we're going. It'll be hard, but let's do that. And then you look at how do you get there with all the programs and the competencies and the things that people want to look at within a healthcare system. So I think the time, and I thought it was a great time, was COVID really did provide an opportunity for us to be able to quickly pivot on some things, to bring into practice things that would have taken centuries to do. Responsiveness of systems, seeing the nurse as the leader in the system, working with teams to transform processes in a work environment. All of that was a great opportunity to start saying, how do we catalyze all these nurses and use that energy and the work that they're doing, rather than looking at a burnout situation, a creative one that says, how will we get to where we need to be? All that then cascades back into how do you educate? How do you select people for the profession? How do you educate the people? How do you create environments for the people to thrive and grow and innovate? That is the first step in the process. And I think I alluded to it, and I've alluded to it many times. We have so many nursing organizations, and I believe you probably told me there were hundreds of them, hundreds of these, all with their little niche markets that they're growing and looking at a piece of it, but nobody's got the collective view. So it's like anything, you can't go anyplace unless you know where you're going, or at least some semblance of it. Creating that image for people and getting consensus and getting off of the retroactive, let's fix stuff. Let's create new stuff and move it in that direction. Bullying is a great one. That's existed in environments. This is all around professional identity of nurses and understanding how that identity is formed, how it evolves, and what do we need to do with that. It's trying to fix a problem, but how does it progress us in the long run to creating the image that we want? So it has to go back even further than that. It's got to be back to who you choose to go in to the profession, what you choose to educate them, how flexible that is. We look at competencies. AACN now has 21, I think they came out with professional identity competencies. I think they miss the point in some ways because it's looking at skill set. It's looking at all the technical, which I think we need to. But on the other hand, it's not looking at that. It's not looking at roles from my perspective. The student nurse is not a miniature seasoned nurse. They're very, very different developmentally, cognitively, and the roles that you play as a student versus what a seasoned nurse does, you evolve into them. So how do you create cultures that do that? It's not a mini nurse that you're looking at. Everybody's alike. They just haven't gotten there. Their thinking ability isn't there. They haven't had enough experience in different environments that support the development of not just the personal identity. And that's a key. Who you choose to go in, you need to have those traits: loyalty, honesty, thinking of others, self-reflection, all those kind of moral attributes. But then as a profession, how do you create in organizations, in school, in academic, how to develop and evolve that role that people will play so that they can be entrepreneurs and innovators, et cetera, other than a curriculum that says this is what you got to do that.
And how do we do that, right? So leadership development, it has to begin at the moment the student nurse is selected,
Right.
something that you actually. How do we reimagine nursing curricula that reflects that? How do we keep from eroding excellence and nursing greatness by picking students who have these quality traits that you mentioned? How do we do this? How do we revision this image?
Right. I think it takes a collective group between academia and practice, whatever the practice arenas are, and whoever the people are that are looking to develop that curriculum. We are very much bound by, and I could be wrong about this, but I think bound by NCLEX. So the science that you have to know to pass a test. And once you pass it, you're it forever. You take some CEUs, I take some CEUs, and nobody ever really comes back to look at the competency and the role development that has happened. We have great examples in medicine. They finally moved into those areas that if you you want to be recertified as an internal medicine doctor every 5 years, 10 years, as the curriculum changes, as science has evolved, you got to pass that test. And if you don't pass that test, you lose the ability to practice to the extent that it is. We don't have those markers in our systems whatsoever. So we have one test that predicts everybody. Whether you got it through 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, that tells you. If you can get it after 2 years, why would you waste your time for 4? Oh, we expound on that, but it's testing to a test, not to the external environment and what's occurring and the science that has emerged over the time you started. I'm a nurse for 40 some odd years. I don't even know how many now, but I mean, what I learned then, that was the science then. But what's evolved is minuscule compared. So you have to reframe how you teach, and you have to reframe who is teaching. So though we have faculty that are developing competencies for students, many times on their own without the practice environment around them, saying, no, that's not what you need. And if you want to go out into this community, let me tell you what you better figure out about food banks that you don't know anything about, or housing situations, or whatever you got to figure out. That's not there. It's more diabetes, chronic illness, whatever the test speaks to. So that's got to change. So how do you do that? Competencies for faculty have to be established that says you have ongoing knowledge, and not just the theoretical. It's got to be balanced to some degree with the actual lived experience of developing in these areas. Same with research, whatever area you go into. So I think if I looked and say revisioning, I think you have to have all the major nursing organizations that are out there, the ones that support academia, the ones that support some kind of certification, and those kind that says, let's get the image of that nurse out there. And these are the elements that have to be embedded in terms of everybody focuses on critical thinking. Critical thinking emerges in environments. How are you teaching that? How is the organization that you move into supporting your development in obtaining those skill sets? And does the organization, as it's evolving, or is it evolving towards a future of transformation? My experience with the word transformation is everybody thinks they're transforming something. And the reality is they're tweaking old stuff. The bigger question we have to answer is, many of the things that are happening today are things I had the great fortune of putting into place 30 and 40 years ago. Why are they not sustainable and move from that level on? What it's like back to something that happened that says, and I'll give you the example, the mentoring process. Now outsourcing that to a registered nurse at the bedside, faculty who don't have the experience. Well, the staff nurse gets paid some money, a mentor, a preceptor, whatever we're calling people now, preceptor, to actually take care of the faculty's 4 or 5 students clinically. And the burden is shifted from the faculty to the staff, and we're reimbursing. We did that in the trauma center years ago, 40 years ago, that you actually, because you realized back then, faculty didn't have the skill set to work in the critical care unit, that we had people who actually knew this stuff pretty good, and reimburse them for additional efforts and created roles for them. And I'm saying reimburse because that's what clinical ladders emerged, that kind of thing. So why don't we sustain things is the question that we know work,
right,
and move them to the next level versus, and some of it's with continuity, some of it's with voice, some of it's, those are the factors. I think these what I recommend advisory groups look and say, get away from, I teach leadership, you teach certification. What is this big image? You're the leaders, technically in education and practice. Where are we heading? Give us some notion of that. And then let's create and back step then. What is the curriculum faculty have to know about? What do they have to be proficient in, et cetera? I think that's a starting point. And then work on your unique things. If you're there for certification for critical care nurses or ED nurses, that's a little niche thing. Great. But all the leadership competencies should be the same, rather than every group is reinventing the wheel around leadership. And then you have all, people who are entrepreneurial out there creating programs that you should come into for CNOs of the future. I did it. CNOs, what do you need to know as an executive? Creating leadership. Standardization of some of these things that mean something, and you don't have 50 million of them. That are creating. NLN has a leadership, AONL has a leadership, the School of Minnesota has a leadership, Hopkins has leadership development. Many of them are revenue generating, which, is great from an entrepreneurial, but there's not standardization. And do they actually achieve anything? Other than everybody's happy that they go to these things, they learn so much, then you put them back in an environment. Are they able to do things with that? It's a slower way to go. And it's a way to go, but it's probably not maximizing the efforts to be key players at the table in the transformation of healthcare.
Thank you for that point. And I want to touch on standardization from the level of the students and schools. What are your thoughts about different entry pathways into nursing,
Mm-hmm.
the LPN, LVN, we have the ADN, we have the BSN, we have the accelerated BSN. What are your thoughts about those different levels of entry? Do you think that it will do us a disservice in reframing the public and professional understanding of the standard roles within nursing, where we want to be seen, like you said, as scientists, as economists, as epidemiologists, as entrepreneurs? Do you think that this has a bearing on how these roles might be perceived?
Yeah, I do. I think there are many, when you look back, probably, I'm going to guess at this, maybe back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, there were maybe 10 or 11 roles in healthcare. Now there must be 5,000. And that's a reflection of science advancing, et cetera. But how you get into something has to have some level of standardization so that you're selecting, you're guaranteeing the efficacy of the product that's coming out of what it is and the ability, then everybody can work from that base to improve upon it. I think we have done a disservice, though people have contributed in many, many ways to advanced practice and specialty kinds of areas of advanced practice. However, at the end of the day, when you have many different kinds of roles, the community doesn't understand that. They understand some of the basics. There's a doctor and there's a nurse. And I'm not knocking that you don't educate smart people around that and they get it. But that is very hard to comprehend. And I think it does. It pulls apart from the energy of going forward. People understand today, I think to a great degree, that you have advanced practice nurses. Now you have, and legitimately you have, doctorates in nursing practice that many people have used to take the educational track to get them into administrative kinds of things. Those titles, I think, do confuse people in the long run. So I think there are lots of roles you can have, but titling and the ability to expect the public to understand that is kind of hard. They're getting basic titles. Most people today probably can tell you what a physician's assistant sort of does. They can't discern the education that person has that's very different than an NP. And why would you want an NP? I mean, I can remember going around with many of our physician staff to say, why you want the nurse practitioner is you're looking at someone who understands the lived experience of the patient and has had some level of years of education prior to. A physician's assistant was someone, God love him, who came out and post any degree could go into school and it's 2 years or whatever, where you had a different level of practitioner coming out of the nurse practitioner school. I think they are confusing, and I think we've got a line around how do you figure that out? Because it's very hard for the public to discern that. And you put an expectation, if you're constantly explaining who you are and what you're doing, it says like that to me is just creating more burdens that you gotta get over,
Yeah.
I think it does. And I'm sure I would get a lot of pushback on that, Nello, in terms of people who say you can be a nurse 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and all of those things. There's some basic things you need to have as a competency as a nurse, and whatever that is, everybody should meet them. NCLEX is geared towards that science kind of thing. And I don't even know if it's the latest science, to be honest, that now comes out of that. But then as you move further along the line, degrees and other kinds of certification are are important metrics, I think, that look in your profession that say you've achieved a level of that.
Yeah. You brought up the idea of even changing the name nurse, right? In a previous
Right.
conversation. That is revolutionary and controversial,
Yes.
right? But could the term nurse be a double-edged sword, right? Comforting to the public, but confining to the profession. What do you imagine are some of the drawbacks of the term nurse, and what do you think a new title might convey that the current one does not?
Right. I've struggled with that and I can't come up with a new title. So I'll start with that. I have none. But I do think it really does hold us back. And either that and the step up where the lived experience of patients with nurses is seen as problem solver, critical thinker, person that activates and changes things in their environment and sees that we're stuck with what the vision of the nurse has been. It's, you got the nurse, the doctor is the healer. Who is the nurse? The carer, what is the word that keeps coming up? And it doesn't blend out to all the attributes that we're looking to say. I don't know what you would change it to, but either that or the marketing of who we are and the reflection of how we practice and how we're seen by the public in the forms that they meet us in, that's the only thing that's going to change, a nurse image. Other than that, I think we're stuck in you see it all the time, the lady with the lamp, and I'm not knocking those things, but they're images that are embedded in people's minds. When you go through Nurses Month and Nurses Week, it's still back to reflecting that. You need a picture of somebody who's mixing DNA and RNA and coming up with some new genetic code that they resolve. That's a nurse, nurse Ann. Yeah.
They exist. There are nurse researchers out there. And so if they exist, why are they not being
Right,
portrayed?
right.
Or,
That's exactly right. The same with, and I think it comes back as things are slower, but you got to move them. Things like engineering. You look at and there's one program, and I forget where it is, that actually has embedded in the nursing curriculum engineering, biomedical engineering. Nurses are great at stuff, like, all kinds of technical kinds of stuff too. That whole thing about engineering and developing those kinds of things, how do you get that out in the forefront?
it's a program here in my state of Maryland.
Yeah. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
I won't say the name of it, but
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. So there's some things like that I think if we marketed that, and that's an image of the nurse scientist is doing this, and it's next to the guy who's doing the cardiac, new heart machine or the new, valve replacement thing, engineering something that does that. That will go away hand in hand with the re-imaging of who we are and what we can do. I think many people have talked to the marketing and how we are seen in the public eye, that it's really not necessarily out there. But that becomes something the organizations, I think, if they pull together collectively to say, here's where we are, here's who we are, here's where you're going, that sort of thing. Because in everybody's public image, even in families, my own, like, you're a nurse, it's like less than you, and not my family, but they know better, but you're a nurse, the doctor says, it's like, how do you, and it's not about the power, it's about the knowledge, because if you look at anything, when you look at transforming healthcare and moving it again into the community and self-care and wellness, that always was the nurse. Now you see that it's the doctors, moving it back into the community, looking for those roles or whatever. When all along that always, like I shared with you, with the Dominican Sisters of Sick Poor, they were public health nurses. We went to people's houses, out in New York City, because no doctor went out necessarily or did the kind of let me wash you, bathe you, whatever was needed, but it was all about quality of life kinds of things. So I don't know the new word that we would need, but it's either imaged differently, and that is out there and seen and lived. So when you go into any office I go into today, that's even down here in Arkansas, and you meet a nurse, it's still under the guise, there's not a whole lot of independent practice. It's filling out forms, taking you in. It's not, really looking at who are you and what do you need, and what can I do to get you. So that's been my experience. Really.
That is so wild because you came from many years ago, talking about how you were responsible to know everything there was about your
Yes.
patient.
Yes.
And you would think that years later we would be moving forward.
Right.
And it's
Right.
so we're either stuck or we're kind of going backward,
Right.
uh, which is frustrating to
Yes.
say the
Yes.
least.
Yeah.
Um, but I want to really talk about activation because one of your rallying cries is less philosophizing and more
Yeah.
activation.
Yeah.
First, what does activation look like to you? And
Yeah.
if you were tasked, we've talked about an
Hmm.
advisory.
Yes.
If you were convening an advisory board, right?
Yeah.
Leaders from national organization, nursing organizations, health systems, what would be your first three priorities
Yeah.
in that?
Yeah. The first biggest thing I believe is focusing on the output of the product, the patient. What is the patient of the future going to need, and how do we get them from here to there? Getting a healthy person. So you find a commonality that everybody has an interest in. So not just I'm the educator, I'm the clinician, I'm the researcher, but what is the future of healthcare, the optimal way patients should receive care, and the roles then around those care. So how do you look at the needs of that in the future? So that includes, there's a genetic component to it, there's a technical component, there's all of those components to it. That gets people off. I think my specialty is, and I know this piece of it. You got to get them to the bigger picture. What will the people need? Because that's what you're creating roles for. Is what's going to be happening to them out there, and what do they need to live till 110 and better, healthy lives? So that's one of the first priorities: getting people to find a common experience that they can focus on. Then you got players around that who will make that happen for the patient. Who are those players? Well, let's take a look. A nurse is. What will then the nurse be able to do given that this is the scenario for patients? Wellness oriented, home oriented, whatever it may be, blocking off 10 years at a time. What's going to happen? AI. I mean, I don't think we've done anything with where that's going to markedly affect. And I'm talking 3 years of who we are and what we do and where are we as it relates to the care of the patient with that kind of stuff. And I think that's one of the first steps is pulling those people together to look at something bigger than themselves. And that's patients' healthcare and healthcare of the future. So it's talking about system change. It's talking about moving from the design we currently have to a new design. And how do you get to that new design? You have all the tools. We have all the tools that possibly are needed, but we have not fed them into a system collaboratively to look at it. So when you look at care of a patient, it is interprofessional, it is interdisciplinary, it is the team working together. And unless that's occurring and the education is occurring together around specialty and significance of coming together on what we're doing for this patient, not what I'm doing for myself to grow and learn, but the patient, I'd say that's the second priority. You're assembling teams of people that really have to focus on the patient. Then you figure out what you contribute to that. Then you figure out the education. Then you figure out the program. Then you figure out who gets into your program, backing it down. That would be what I'd say for the next 3 to 5 years. People talking about transformation. And I actually belong to, you interviewed Kathleen Bartholomew, who's a great, great soul in looking at nurses transforming healthcare. It's nurses contributing to the transformation of healthcare because it is a team. You got to change everything if you're transforming and not just tweaking it, not just here's the role just for the nurse. Look, I always say, look at the end product. Look to the patient. What will they need and how do we make that happen? Then you kind of say it is an interdisciplinary process and that's where we have to focus. And it's not just about reimbursement and it's not about fighting for a place at the able, that we're heard. It's actually creating, and I've shared this. I don't know if I share it with you, but I had the good fortune. I worked with on an interim basis at SSM Health, and the, they call it the public utility model, and nursing is looking at that public utility. But they did a great thing. They took very different systems in St. Louis or around wherever it was in Missouri, and they got people to sit around the table. So they had a CEO, I'm going to say from, I should know this better, from Trinity, from Ascension, from all these big systems, and they said, each wanting to do better than the other, me taking my patients from you, that kind of, that's the name of the game in healthcare and acute care. Who has the patients, has the money, has the revenue, can do things. But they thought bigger, and they said, what's the problem we're all facing? And the problem they all faced was with patients who were diabetics. And these patients, as you probably well know, I know definitely, clog up your ED. They're in and out. They have terrible, their systems of care aren't there. They don't follow through. Because you got social determinants of health, But what they took was the problem. And the problem that they knew they could handle was insulin that they needed. These people were titrating it down because they couldn't afford it. So rather than once a day, take whatever you did, they did once a day, take half of it or a quarter of it. So they always had problems, And they said they put money together. It was philanthropy that they used as well as, and they got from these systems a commitment because nobody was fighting over these patients, but they were focused on the patient and trying to do some good. And they ended up developing a system that is basically like a public utility model, but essentially everybody put in 10 million bucks and they created a warehouse, they developed their making, and they sold the patients could get the insulin at cost. So rather than $5,000 a month, it was, I'm making it up, I don't know what it was, 30 a month or something like that, whatever it was. But they showed you a way around getting around pharma. They showed you a way of getting around cultures that say we compete with each other. They work together. They work together to solve an issue. That's what we've got to do in nursing. You want to transform something, you got to work together to solve it. Then you back it down from there. So it's a big thing that we're facing here, but reimbursement, you have lots of nursing groups. I think it's wasted energy, to be perfectly honest, to go out there, and most people don't know. You can. Most hospitals do build, even if it's in the room and board fee. There's a nursing billing for nursing care is in there. The more you extract out professions from billing, the more you make the bigger the problem that now it costs too much money because everybody has a little dog in the fight. You got to look at the patient, what do they need, and how best can you do that? We don't have people that are that interested in doing that, unfortunately. So
thank you so much
yeah.
for chatting with me. It's been such a pleasure. Thanks for your innovative and kind of collaborative spirit,
Yeah.
really, and just for the legacy that you're leaving on this profession. We appreciate it. So meaningful to
Yeah.
me because that we have the next generation coming, and we're looking to your example to kind of pass the baton and keep
Yeah.
the torch burning. So
Yeah.
thank you so much.
You're
We're going to
welcome.
quickly to our media section and play
Okay.
our game.
Yeah.
And I'm going to roll this up into one. So I'm going to pick your category, and then you tell me what your thoughts are. I know that, like we talked about, you're not
Yeah.
a TV watcher,
Right.
but you have, just any thoughts about how nurses are currently portrayed in media. And then based on the category that I pick, if you can come up with a script for a show or whatever it is I pick out to kind of represent nurses in a more accurate light,
Yeah.
right? All
Okay.
right, let's go. All
You're good at this.
right, and here I go. This is cool. So your category is reality TV. Oh man.
Yeah. Okay. So I have in my head the image of, and I've probably had it for a long time, the image of This Old House. I think is what the TV show is called, or This Old Home, This Old Whatever. And what they did on this show was they would find these very old, many times old, dilapidated, rundown, not cared for homes that had some level of character, some level of appeal, some level of oldness that got lost in time. And it still stood and it still functioned, but it had lost the glamour or the elegance that it once had. And I would see that's a little bit about the history of nursing, that we've had an incredible foundation. We've had something that's lasted a long time. But how do you preserve the good from the past, the beauty and the elegance and the importance of the personal identity, professional identity, the attributes that nurses have always been known for, and yet redesign, revamp, re-improve using many things from the past as elements still and recreate in this time a far more doable, workable, livable new structure from this old home that still is reflective of the history from which it came and yet is now modernized to move us forward into the history we're creating in going forward and having elements from the past but more looking to how do we make it a work of the future. And I see that as the nurse leading along with, you need architects, you need engineers, you need plumbers, you need people who have a lot of stuff they got to fix in this, redo. But you need someone who comes with the history of what worked in the past, but also the vision of what will work in the future. And that's the nurse. And nurses can lead that charge, transforming healthcare. You don't need a doctor. You need a team that has all these disciplines on it to create the vision for the future. And that's what's really important. And it goes back to not looking just internally, but it's looking at who do we serve and what we're trying to accomplish. And if you look at that, that will guide you always as to who you need to be and what you need to know to do that. So, and we skipped over this point a little bit, but I honestly believe about the accountability to the calling that you have. It is not a part-time calling. It's a calling about being smart, continuing your education, knowing more, being creative. It's all of those kinds of things. And you have to look that you have the wherewithal to do that in addition to the life that you're leading, that it can't be a part-time kind of thing that you contribute a bit there. It's got to be full blown, moving it. So as we have entrepreneurs that come up with looking at little isolated pieces, how do we grow the bigger picture so that you're still not talking about bullying in 2030? It's over. It's done with. That was our history. We no longer do that because here's what we do. Anybody coming in does this. This is how you speak. We no longer have leaders who don't talk. We have leaders who say, hey, this is how we're leading. That kind of thing. That's the whole notion of moving it forward, being accountable to make it happen.
Yes, they need to be unity.
Yeah. Yes.
That's the purpose.
Yes.
In order to meet this standard, right?
Yeah.
One can here, the other one's there. There has to be like the soul of what nursing is.
Yeah.
What we represent.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we can't have peripheral ideas
Right.
and other ideas that we aspire to,
Right.
but there has to be something that is central and core.
That's right.
To who.
And then you activate. So you have, groups that do policy. Policy is a piece of paper. How do you make that happen? And how do you consistently hold people accountable to make it happen in their organizations? If we have policy driven activities out of nursing organizations, it's great to talk about social determinants of health. What are you doing? So write the policy, but make the policy happen, because that's where a lot of the research goes. It's nice and you listen and you look at it, but nobody does anything or fewer people use it. How do you make that connectivity better?
Thank you
It's a
so
big
much.
job.
It is. It's
Yeah.
a huge job.
Yeah.
But I think you capture it so well. The article really spoke to my soul.
Yeah.
And that we were able to talk about it and really dissect these issues of our history, leadership, where we're going, the future, the competencies that we need to build into every curriculum, really just the standards that we need to uphold.
Yeah.
It's such a delight talking with you today.
Same here, Nello. Yeah.
just for sharing your heart. And thank you to all my guests for being here and
Mhm.
sticking with us. Grateful that you guys continue to ride with me. And it's such a pleasure to be the host on this platform. Please like, share, and subscribe. And we will see you guys in the next one.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you. Thanks, Nella, for your time too and all you're doing for us. It helps.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Thanks for hanging with me till the end. I hope you gained some valuable insight into the world of nursing. If today's episode inspired you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear about the amazing work nurses are doing. Let's keep breaking stereotypes and reshaping the narrative together. I'll see you next time.